I don't think they were favored versus Boston in 2008. Maybe there's some resource that we can look that up, but I think almost everybody thought the Celtics were going to coast their way to that championship in 2008. Hello everybody, welcome to Also Rusty Buckets. If you're over on YouTube, go ahead and subscribe to the channel and drop a like. It helps the video do better in the algorithm, so it is much appreciated. And if you want to enjoy this as an audio-only experience, check us out over on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. We're back with hot takes. You know what it is. Let's get into it. From Metal Moto. The NBA should allow analysts to score and critique NBA refs on each game they officiate and give them a grade on correct and incorrect calls made over the season, and that grade should be advertised like players' stats. I do think there is some version of what you are referring to. In some ways, it's not like some directly tangible and easily accessible thing, but I do believe there is a review process for pretty much every call that is then released in some sort of statement. It's done in a way that is often very frustrating because it'll be like, yeah, we got that play wrong, just letting you know. The result's still the same, but we did fuck up. Anyways, will there be any repercussions for this? Not really. I think refs and coaches are kind of in a similar tier where a lot of people talk about them with a level of confidence that I don't understand. Rarely do I think officiating is just like through and through terrible. Rarely do I think there are series or games that are quote-unquote rigged, and it's a fucking hard job to do. People seem to think like the NBA isn't hiring good refs, but it's like, who do you think can afford to employ refs for the most amount for the longest? It's the NBA. I think there are people who are over-assuming the potential of humans to get a call correct, but the reality is the best of the best are still gonna fuck up all the time. If you get the best refs who have ever fucking refereed in their entire life and you have them ref an NBA game, there are still going to be calls that upset people. There are still going to be calls that swing the game that most people think are bullshit. It's just kind of part of the process of what happens here. I don't disagree that there should be some sort of system that we should see what is going right, what's going wrong, what refs have what reputations. I think this is an issue that is unavoidable. There's really nothing you can do to stop it. It's just a part of life. Like, we can't get down to 0 common cold deaths. There's just gonna happen. That'll happen sometimes. Refs making a bad call, it will happen no matter who it is, all the time. So I don't disagree, but I also don't think this is as big of a problem as a lot of people seem to think. From H. Hothy, I think DeMar and Stephen A. Smith are delusional. I don't think the Raptors would have won a championship with DeMar DeRozan instead of Kawhi in 2019. I don't think DeMar would have been able to score effectively against Philly or the Bucks, and you can't put him on Giannis like you can put Kawhi. Yeah, I just did not agree with either of those guys, and specifically DeMar was probably more impassioned about that given that he is the subject of it. DeMar DeRozan maybe could replicate a good amount of the offensive production that Kawhi brought to the table, but I don't think there's a chance in hell with the lack of defensive versatility that he brings, or really defense period, let alone versatility, that there really would have been enough there. They maybe could have still won the East because of DeMar potentially being able to effectively replace that production if you get a couple of good playoff series from him in a row, which generally is a rarity, but if we're being generous here, maybe that could happen. I still don't think that you would be able to effectively do what they did against the Bucks with the wall system, where you would put Kawhi on Giannis initially and then have, whether it be Serge Ibaka or Marc Gasol, those guys bringing help defense at the rim. If that's DeMar DeRozan instead, we're talking about a very different situation. Against Philadelphia, I think they still could have won that, but then again, like, if he has the Jimmy Butler matchup, is he going to score on Jimmy effectively? I don't really think so. I just don't think they're winning that championship in 2019 with DeMar instead of Kawhi. I understand why DeMar feels that way, though, and it's his right to feel that way. I'm just going to have to disagree. From OU8428, the Lakers were favored in the 2004 finals versus the Pistons, and Kobe was the reason they lost in the series. They were also favored versus Boston in 2008, and he blew it, but he gets all the credit for being carried by Powell, Odom, Fisher, and Artest. Weird. Okay, I was with you at the start. The first take that the 2004 finals was mostly Kobe's fault I'm with you on that. A lot of it was that he wanted the finals MVP, and he was like, I'm just going to shoot the ball every time, and hopefully it'll work. But unfortunately, he was going against a historic defense, so it didn't. However, I don't think they were favored versus Boston in 2008. Maybe there's some resource that we can look that up, but I think almost everybody thought the Celtics were going to coast their way to that championship in 2008. Like, as far as the Lakers are concerned, like, yeah, Kobe and Pau is probably a better top two players than Pierce and Garnett, but as for how the rest of that roster works, there's a rather steep decline. And the notion that Pau, Odom, Fisher, and Artest carried Kobe is fucking hilarious because their offensive production was nowhere near like Derek Fisher averaged what, 8-9 points per game? You got carried by Derek Fisher, huh? Yeah, that makes a lot of fucking sense. No, that's not true at all. The first part of this take, accurate. Second part of it is silly. Boston was more likely than not, I'm almost certain they were favored in it, and if they weren't, then that's stupid because they should have been favored in it because they were a better team, a more well-rounded roster, and were just more prepared. Pau Gasol was added to that roster like 40, 50 games into the season, okay? That is a rarity to even make the finals with a mid-season edition of that kind of significance, let alone actually winning it, against a super team that had peak Kevin Garnett, basically peak Paul Pierce, and Ray Allen as well. Obviously, their numbers were reduced because of their difference in opportunity, but a crazy stacked roster that won the title, understandably. No, I just can't get behind that. Kobe was definitely by far and away the best player on the 09 and 2010 rosters. Whatever. From Bo Honixu, I think. Superstars wanting to win by forcing a trade is stupid. If they truly want to win, they should do it in a free agency without making the destination franchise lose good role players/assets. Such moves will most likely make their legacy worse. I guess it's not a hot take, but few people talk about it. Here's the thing. A lot of those instances, you're talking about players who you just couldn't have afforded to have on top of everything else. Like, as an example, like the Carmelo Anthony trade, Wilson Chandler and Danilo Gallinari went to Denver in that move. You couldn't have afforded to pay all three of those guys if Melo just came through free agency, so they probably would have had to be moved one way or the other. But I also think this is becoming more and more true as time goes on, because the assets that are involved in these major trades are just becoming larger and larger. Like, if you compare a trade from the 2000s for a superstar player versus a trade from the 2020s for a superstar player, you're practically getting double, if not 3 times what you used to in those deals. So from that end, yeah, I think you are hurting your team significantly more now than if you did make that happen through free agency. Also, it is worth mentioning that a lot of the times it's players who have multiple years on their contract. Like the Carmelo Anthony example, he was going to be a free agent that offseason. So I can see how you'd be like, hey, why would you put your team in this position? You can just be there very soon. But like, let's say Kevin Durant to Phoenix, for example. Kevin Durant had a couple of years left on his contract, and he is in his 30s. So is he going to wait until he's 37 and he's a free agent to join the Phoenix Suns? I don't think so. I don't think that makes a lot of sense. So there are cases where it would be better to just wait, but more often than not, the actual circumstances required for that to work are actually not there. From Cavarder, potential is wildly overrated in NBA discourse. People love to praise guys like Zion or Ben Simmons back in the day because they'd be unstoppable if they quote-unquote just developed a jumper. Most, quote, easy fixes to a player's game are not easy at all, and 99% of the time it's obvious the player can't or won't develop such a major facet. Being young does not equal having infinite Michael Jordan potential. I could not agree more with what you're saying here. I think potential is routinely used as an excuse for not doing stuff that you should as a franchise. You know, we're not going to trade this young player because he has potential. We've seen teams drag that out for a very long amount of time and see nothing for it. Oftentimes potential is valued to a degree that I don't understand in trades, where a guy who is okay but has a lot of upside will be traded for a guy who's like established to be good right now without any hesitation. And like, if there's like a major age difference, I get that. But in cases where like you're trading a good role player for a guy who you hope can maybe one day be a good role player, why are you bothering with that when you have the guy now? Like, if I was operating as a general manager, I would be more about the guarantee. I like potential. I like players who have potential, but a lot of people talk about players who have potential as though that potential is just going to be fulfilled. The reality is most people who have the potential to be really, really good do not live up to that potential. Even then, what even is that potential? How much is there to actually feel solid about versus how much of it is pretty much pure speculation? Like, just because you can jump really high when you're 18 doesn't mean you'll be able to do it when you're 30. Just because you have taken a couple of mid-range jumpers like Andrew Wiggins did doesn't mean you're actually going to be good at that in your career. And specifically your Zion and Ben Simmons example, the fucking like all they need to do is develop a jump shot take. People say that shit for dudes who have no shooting ability whatsoever. If you enter the NBA as a complete non-shooter, the likelihood that you will leave it as a good shooter is very minimal. There are not a lot of guys who are outright bad at shooting the ball who then get outright good at it. You might get it to a point where it's manageable, where the defense has to respect you, but that's generally the best case scenario. And more often than not, if you're someone like Zion or Ben Simmons, you will never have a good NBA jump shot. You just simply will not. And it kind of drives me nuts when people go, all he needs to do is learn how to shoot. Oh, you mean that thing that is really hard to learn how to do at an NBA level? And just because you're 20 and you have time to develop does not mean that you're actually going to develop. That's the other thing about it. Like, plenty of players enter the league and they're pretty much as good as they're going to be right out of the gate. There's not much improvement to be had from there. Maybe more opportunity down the line, but that's as far as it goes. Lots of players are just young and good, and then they don't get better, and that's fine. And I also don't think we need to knock these players too much for that. 100%. Potential is extremely overrated in NBA discourse. From Lob Edits, Wilt Chamberlain is not a top 10 player of all time and might not even be a top 15 player of all time. The only two players who were truly important from that era, the 60s, not the 70s, was Bill Russell and Wilt Chamberlain. Chamberlain and Bill got a top 10 nod because of how outstanding their accolades are and how much winning they did. But for Wilt, yes, he averaged 50 a game, but he didn't win enough as compared to Bill to overlook the fact that he played in an objectively easier era, and many other guys who average crazy numbers in that era really don't get that same treatment, although I do understand their stats weren't as crazy as compared to Wilt. As for the not top 15 statement, I think that one is a little shakier, but I personally think guys like Giannis, Jokic, Dirk, and maybe KD are ahead of him as far as what they were able to do relative to their era. Maybe Kawhi too, if you want to talk about the 2019 run. Yeah, I don't think you should rank Kawhi that high just off of that one title run, but I do get where you're coming from. I don't have Wilt in my top 10, and I never will, because that top 10 is only going to get more players added to it over time that will bring his spot even further. I do think he's probably top 15. He's probably in my top 15. And the thing is about Wilt, like, if we're just talking about what his peak was and his most effective version of himself, which was in 1967, not 1962, when he averaged 50 points per game, that player is one of the greatest peaks this game has ever seen. 24 points, 24 rebounds, 8 assists per game, God knows how many blocks because they weren't counting them back then, and he shot nearly 70% from the field for the whole season. His team won 68 games, and they destroyed the Boston Celtics in the conference finals in a 5-game gentleman's sweep. I think a lot of the reason that Wilt isn't in my top 10 isn't even things that are necessarily his fault, but rather just a misunderstanding of how you should utilize a star player in the NBA. When he first came onto the scene, it was just like, yeah, I'm dropping 35 every night without even fucking trying. People are like, or the coaching staff's like, okay, well, we're not going to stop you. Keep doing that. The reality is, though, he overshot the ball. The reality is he averaged 45 points per game on a team that won fucking 28 games. I think a lot of people do not evaluate Wilt's career as it actually was. They just go on Basketball Reference and they see 50 points per game and it's like, whoa, that's a lot of points per game. We got to automatically slot this guy into the top 10. But when you compare him to other people who are in the top 10, they had more effective winning play styles for much longer stretches of their careers. Wilt Chamberlain is overrated, and he is not a top 10 player of all time. I recognize he put up ridiculous stats, but those ridiculous stats were to his and his team's detriment, not a commentary on his level of talent. Maybe sure you go, averaging 50 is impressive regardless, and yeah, it is impressive, but ultimately how I rank players on all-time lists is determined by how effective they are at being a winning basketball player. And 24 points per game Wilt in 1967 was a far more effective basketball player than 50 point per game Wilt was in 1962 when his team won 48 games at that. I agree. Definitely overrated, definitely not in my top 10. From Crispies, people drool all over the fact that Tim Duncan played in a fundamental way too much now. What is usually something that makes a player much less appreciated has catapulted Tim Duncan into a realm he has no business being in. I don't know that a lot of people factor in the fundamentalness of Tim Duncan's game as some like overwhelming positive to help him in his perception in his career. For the most part, I still think it did hurt him in terms of his legacy more than it helped him. There might be more people willing to give Duncan his flowers now, but in his actual career, the dude was just not that popular because he played fundamentally. I definitely do think that there are people who will be like, yeah, Tim Duncan is top 5 all time because he's fundamental, but I don't know, fundamental is more of a descriptor of play style than it is actual ability. Like, most players who are good and in Tim Duncan's realm both have fundamental ability and can do a bunch of flashy shit, not like fucking, I don't know, Kareem didn't know how to box out. I don't think that's much of a problem. And I don't really think it favors Tim Duncan. I also don't really think it knocks him as much as it used to. I don't think there's a lot of people who are like, Tim Duncan, well, he was so fundamental, you have to put him top 5. I just don't think I see that often. And I see a lot of fucking opinions about Tim Duncan. Tim Duncan is a popular subject in these hot takes videos. Everyone's got something to say. From @Curry, Draymond Green is better than Rodman, and it's not even close. He's better at every aspect apart from rebounding, and people act like they are on the same level. I wouldn't go as far as to say not even close. I do think that Draymond is better than Rodman, and that's more because of the offensive side of the ball. Both of them not really good offensive players, but Draymond at least brought being a really good passer to the fold for Golden State, which was a dynamic that Rodman really didn't bring to the table, especially if we're also just going like comparing peak for peak. At his absolute peak, Draymond Green was actually a decent scorer. He averaged 14 points and shot well from 3 on decent volume one year. That is much better offensively than Dennis Rodman ever came anywhere close to. The other factor is, in terms of defensive ability, Draymond Green more versatile than Rodman. Rodman was one of the more versatile defenders of his era, but you got to factor in that spacing-wise, he had a much less room that he had to deal with defending. I mean, it's just a product of the era, of course. That's a big part of it, but I don't think that his era defensively was nearly as hard to be a good defender. Now, he was extremely versatile. He could defend big men and wings and guards, but you could say the same thing about Draymond Green, and he did it in an era where that versatility was more necessary for success. So, yeah, I do think Draymond is better. Obviously, Rodman kills him in the rebounding department, but in terms of what I actually think makes you a contributing winning player, especially if we're talking like fucking Bulls Dennis Rodman, like there are people who think Bulls Dennis Rodman is better than like peak Draymond Green. That's ridiculous. It's straight up ridiculous to think that that's the case. Draymond Green is one of the most polarizing and hated on players in the NBA. Weirdly enough, Dennis Rodman is a weird guy, to say the least, but doesn't really seem to be hated on. A lot of people love him for his weirdness. Meanwhile, people hate Draymond Green for his brand of weirdness, which I understand one of them is more appealing than the other. But this discussion, Rodman versus Draymond, I feel like it routinely just has some of the worst opinions that I hear. From Sunny D, everybody gives the Bucks a hard time because they hired Doc Rivers when the real mistake was firing Coach Bud and replacing him with a rookie head coach. People bring up the 30-13 record, but they had the easiest schedule in the league, had a bottom 10 defense, and were in dog fights with the Pistons. Hiring Doc was still a mistake, but they didn't have many options, unlike in the offseason. Yeah, I definitely think that Budenholzer should have still been there, especially given the fact that they fired him like right after his brother died. Not the coolest thing in the world. I realize it's a business and you can't factor in the emotion of it all too much, but I honestly didn't think Budenholzer needed to go. He obviously coached them to a championship in 2021, and while I do feel like sometimes the dude could be too stubborn, he was still one of the better coaches in the NBA, and he was well liked by the players on the Bucks. They were bonded by having won that title together, so I think it would have been best to keep him around. I myself have said, just fucking bring him back. Might as well just do that. They didn't do that, and yeah, I do think that Doc Rivers is not a good coach, and it was a mistake to hire him. But I think that was just the second mistake in the order of mistakes that they had. Maybe third if you consider hiring, what's his name? David Griffin to also be one of them. Adrian. What did I say? David Griffin. Yeah, different Griffin. From Cheaps Ahoy. If you already have two superstars, there's nobody in NBA history you should add on the team over Klay Thompson. That probably tracks. It could depend a little bit on what your two superstar players are, what position and play style they have. But if we're presuming like big man guard or big man perimeter player or two perimeter players, then yes, Klay would be the option. If your two superstars are guys who really don't dribble the ball all too much, you'd probably want your third guy to be somebody who can dribble the ball, unlike Klay Thompson. However, if we're talking about you already have a really prominent ball handler and you don't really need anybody to be able to do that elsewhere, then yeah, Klay Thompson, oh my God, what a perfect third option. From Do Like Stuff, if Draymond had offense, he'd be LeBron James. Yeah, man. And if Steph had defense, he would be Marcus Smart. What am I supposed to do with that? That's flip this take and say that LeBron is like Draymond on defense, which I don't even really agree with other than the versatility thing. But no, that's a fucking wild take. From Saturns, Jalen Brunson and Ja Morant will be better point guards than Stephen Curry next year. Yeah, no, I really can't get behind that. Until Steph actually truly falls off, I don't think Steph is that much worse than he was at his absolute peak. And a peak Stephen Curry or a borderline peak Stephen Curry is still miles ahead of Ja Morant, and maybe not miles, but at least a mile ahead of Jalen Brunson. All right, this is going to be the last take of the video from Michael Bernoth. Game evolution didn't just go through players, but coaches as well. Just as you can say players are in general more skilled today, let's say the 90s, so are the coaches. Top-tier coaches would dominate coaching 90s teams, knowing how the game could work differently. Well, that's more about being privy to knowledge than it is about being better, per se. Generally speaking, it seems as though that the evolution of the game happens in spite of coaches very often, because coaches generally tend to be more traditionalist type dudes, guys who are like, this is how you play. A lot of coaches will be stubborn in that, and it took someone like Stephen Curry doing some ridiculous shit for every coach in the league to be like, okay, maybe we were wrong about three-point shooting. I guess we'll change. Otherwise, more often than not, it is a resistance to the coaches that most evolution comes from. Now, that said, coaches like Steve Kerr going along with what Steph is doing and elevating that to an even further degree is also huge. It is also a way to do it. And it is also a big part of what happens with the evolution. But in general, I think players are far less stubborn about how the game's supposed to be played, way more willing to try new things. Also, just from the fact that as a player, especially like if you're a Steph type, you kind of need to evolve the game in order to play in a way that actually makes you super effective. Like if Steph did not change basketball with his three-point shooting, let's say Steph was a 3% worse percentage-wise three-point shooter, and because of that, the Warriors never took off, and Steve Kerr didn't let Steph take 40-foot three-pointers, then he probably just wouldn't have been that good. So he needed to make that evolution in order to be on that level, and there are just going to continue to be players who are revolutionary like that, and I think there is a reason that we end up giving players the credit, because more often than not, it is them. Generally speaking, people who are youthful, people who are younger, are more open to new ideas, are more open to trying new things, not doing things just because this is how we've always done them. And coaches tend to be older dudes who have the exact opposite mentality. So I'm going to have to disagree, mostly because this almost implies that it's on an even playing field, but it is accurate to say that coaches have contributed to the evolution of the game. Fucking obviously that's true. But when we're talking about like something like ball handling being improved by Isaiah Thomas, or defense being changed by, well, this is also the Pistons, but Chuck Daly, there's a coach one for you, or offense shooting being changed by Steph, and those larger, very clear examples of the evolution of the game, pretty much always going to be a player who did that. With that said, that is it. Shout out to Nick for editing this video, and goodbye.